Hello everyone, this is Ben, and in this video we're going to take a look at the question of whether or not the New Testament of the Bible, the books of the New Testament, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, Acts and Romans, the letters of Paul, 1st, 2nd Peter, 1st, 2nd, 3rd John, Hebrews, Revelation, were these letters, were these books of the New Testament, were they altered between the time when they were originally authored? In some cases we don't know who authored them. We have a pretty good idea. But my question, and the question we're taking a look at in this video is, were these texts changed from the time that they were written to the time that they come to us? This is a very common belief I find among, just sort of regular everyday people you talk to. But experts and scholars who study these things they find it very untroubling. It's not a big deal for them. And if you look up this question online, you'll find lots of great articles and lots of good evidence. But the reason I'm making this video is because what I find is the experts and the scholars who explain these things explain sort of the key point, the key pieces of evidence, and they don't really explain the sort of obvious stuff that's obvious to them, but it's not obvious to us. It's not obvious to the rest of us. And so there's certain things that they just all know, and everyone on every side of the debate knows in their world, and the rest of us don't really know that. And then sometimes you have atheists or people who are against Christianity who want to say that, oh, we have no idea what the original authors of the Bible really wrote because it's been changed over time. People recopied it, and they recopied it, and they recopied it, and in that process of recopying it, they changed it. And they describe it like a game of telephone. Once you get to the end of the game of telephone, there's no way to know, what's at the other end. And the opponents who say that the Bible has been changed, they really milk those points that are not obvious to everyday people like you and me. But the people who defend the Bible, they either in many cases they're just regurgitating and parroting what they've learned from experts. But the experts who defend the Bible, basically they don't explain the stuff that's too obvious for them, and so it's not very helpful. So I'm trying to come in and fill that gap. So let's just start with a basic question: if you go to the store and buy a Bible, where does that come from? Well, the Bibles that we buy at the store are printed, so they are made with a big machine that makes lots of copies. Okay, where do they get those printed copies? And you'll notice that they have different ones, like the King James Version, the New International Version, the New American Standard Bible, the English Standard Version, the Holman Christian Standard. You got a lot of different versions. Well, where those versions come from, they tell you in the beginning. The translations, at least the newer ones, are actually copyrighted by different companies. So for example, the New International Version is done by a company called Zondervan, and they're a printing company and a publishing company that makes lots of copies of books and sells them. Okay, they copyright their translation, and they actually will change it. It won't stay the same year after year. But what they'll do is get a team of people together, and that team of people goes back to what's called the manuscripts. And manuscript is a word that means handwritten. So what we have, where these translations of the Bible, these printed translations of the Bible come from, are teams of experts who translate them from an older language into our modern languages. English, for example, didn't exist. These guys date the writing of the Bible, generally speaking, to before 100 AD, all of the New Testament. So today in 2022 AD, we are reading English Bibles, but the English language as we know it didn't exist back then. And the oldest manuscripts we have are all written in Greek. And the word manuscript, manu as in manual, as in manual labor, doing things with your hand, and then script as in writing. inscription, So like, it means literally the handwritten stuff. So the Gutenberg printing press comes along in the late 1400s, okay? And that's when you start having printed material. But before that, you go back to handwritten copies of the Bible, okay? So, all right, so how old, are the manuscripts that we have? Well, the oldest, complete manuscripts of the New Testament date to around, 300 AD. We've got, almost complete stuff before that, and it's sort of around that. And the way that they come up with the dates, there's two ways. One way is called paleography, because handwriting styles change over time, and you can look at the way handwriting styles are done, and you can actually come up with a date based on that. And you can say, well, how do you confirm that date is correct? Well, another way that they check it is with something called radiocarbon dating. So the paper that they used that long ago was made from a plant, like a grass plant called papyrus. And that grassy plant, once you kill it, it starts radioactively decaying. And that radioactive decay decays at a very regular rate, so you can figure out when the plant was harvested and get a date for when the manuscript was written. And you might ask me, well, Ben, how do you know that the radioactive decay rate hasn't sped up or slowed down over time? Or how do you know that you can trust the paleography? Well, the thing is, these are two very different methods of dating a text, and they're very independent of each other. And when those two independent methods converge on the same date, then we know that we have a reliable method of dating. So not every ancient manuscript is dated with radiocarbon dating. They just date some here or there because it's actually destructive to a piece of an ancient manuscript, and you don't want to destroy it. They date enough of them that they can confirm that they know what they're talking about with the paleography. So generally they just do paleography. Now, the thing is, when you find a manuscript, you have to say, well, the text was written before the manuscript. And you say, well, Ben, why do you say that? How do you know that this isn't the first one? Well, it's just unlikely that it's the first one. It's more likely that you're not holding the first one in your hand, for starters. If you find one, the manuscript is probably not the first one. You see, the issue with the papyrus is that it rots over time. In the Middle Ages and even in the late Roman period, they started writing on animal hides like vellum and parchment, and that stuff will not rot and it can last forever. But the older manuscripts that we have are written on this grassy paper stuff, and it just rots. The estimates I've seen is that stuff from the ancient Roman world, and that's how far back we're talking about, 90% of it's just rotted. And the only way that we still have is, for the most part, the Bible or the works of Homer or the Iliad or different philosophical texts or medical or scientific texts from Aristotle. The only way we have that is because people sat down and recopied it. And then when it needed recopying, they recopied it again. And they kept doing that until eventually we get to the really expensive, fancy ones. Which basically, I think this one in 300 AD, there's one called Vaticanus, which is a complete copy of the New Testament. And it's on some sort of animal hide. And we start to see a bunch of those show up, from that point and later. So we can go back to our oldest manuscripts and say, okay, well, obviously the later manuscripts that say come from 700 AD or 1000 AD, they read and they're the same as the one from 300 AD, then okay, we know it wasn't changed. And we know it was written before because it's just more likely that it was written before that. And we find fragments from before, so the fragments, the older papyrus stuff from before our completes, they're not rotted away completely. We find almost completes, or a page where half of it's rotted, or even a credit card size piece is enough. When you take something and lay it down on another piece of paper and all of the words and letters line up, then you know that you've got a piece of that, of Mark, for example. That's a fragment from Mark. Now, the way they come up with the dates is something that scholars argue. I'm not going to go into too much, but generally what's agreed upon is that the New Testament was composed basically 55 to 90 AD. It was nothing before 55 and nothing after 90. Now, those dates are argued about among experts, but I'm giving you the uncontroversial, like no one's really got a real big problem with 55 to 90 AD. That's, so you've got a consensus of historians on that. And they have all sorts of ways that they come up with that. But it's like, for example, you can look at what they're talking about when it was written. You also have other documents with known dates that quote the Bible, so that kind of thing. So our question is like, well, was it changed in this recopying phase? Okay, like 90 AD to 300 AD. That's 200 years, 210 years. Okay. Was it changed in that period, in the earlier period where we don't have completes? Okay, how do we know whether or not it was changed? Well, because you don't have completes that date back that far, then you can't really check every letter, every word to see if they line up and if they're the same. So we have to put our thinking caps on now, and this is where it gets fun. Okay, what people did back in those days was circulate letters like this. So you can't go to a bookstore. You actually there would be people whose, like, it was their job all day to just write stuff down, and they were called scribes. And that could be your career, just like write stuff. You knew how to write, you knew how to read, and you would just make copies of things for people. And so what you do, like, you go to the bookstore and you'd buy some, and this would be really expensive to like buy a book. And then there were no copyright laws back then, because people making copies was really expensive anyway. So you would hire a guy to make a copy of that book, and then you would loan it out to your friends, and everybody would circulate from house to house to house, and everybody would make a copy of it. And books were popular. People bought books, but they were very expensive. Okay. That's called circulation. Okay, and that was the normal thing that was done with anything that people, that more than one person wanted to have to read. Obviously if I wrote you a letter that was addressed to you, then there's no reason for me to make copies for my whole family. But if something's intended to be spread out, then that's what they did. They circulated letters. Okay, so it's very plausible that the letters of the New Testament were were circulated because they were for a lot of people. They clearly had a message that they were trying to put out there for a lot of people. We have further evidence of this. So, for example, with the book of Romans, we have a copy of the book of Romans that leaves off chapter 16 that was found near Ephesus, which is in the other direction. So, I think it's Ephesus. But the point is, that would be evidence that, it was, a copy was made probably by Paul, from the original author, and sent the other direction because he, saw this letter as being meant for, more than just the people in Rome. He wanted the people in Ephesus to have a copy too. But the ending of Romans, in chapter 16, it says, I commend to you our sister Phoebe. Okay, when Paul's commending this person, what's most likely is she is actually the person who's the letter carrier. So, the trustworthy, at least for the Romans, she is the person who's guaranteeing that this comes from Paul. They know her, Paul knows her, Paul's recommending her, okay? But furthermore, in the book of Romans, it specifically greets different people and also greets 4 distinct house churches. Okay, so there's internal evidence already in here that they were circulating this, and it's not a big deal. So, since that was plausible and the normal thing that was done back then, and since the evidence indicates that they were doing that, then what is most likely? What is a rational person going to believe? Where does the weight of the evidence sit, that it was circulated, that the book of Romans was circulated. House churches were a normal thing in the early Christian world. It wasn't like they were having small group Bible study on Wednesday night in people's houses. It was more like in the Roman Empire, having meetings and having groups was actually something that could get you in a lot of trouble. The Roman Empire persecuted all sorts of different religious groups. There was one example where people wanted to start a volunteer fire department. The emperor said no, because he said every group turns political after a while. So the Romans were very paranoid about people having meetings. And so you couldn't really build a meeting place. And so what they would do was like find a little loophole where they would just use an old house that a rich person had as a meeting place and kind of renovate it, but don't change it too much. So that's when they say Christians had house churches, that's what they mean. It doesn't mean like they just met in each other's homes. Like, it's more like they weren't allowed to build a church. So like they had a loophole where it's like, okay, well, I'll just renovate a house, and they were later when Constantine, became the first Christian Roman emperor, he legalized the building of churches, and then, oh my goodness, there was this explosion of architectural vigor, and energy that just like they were building churches like crazy. But Paul greets, a bunch of people, but he greets 4 different houses, and so the important thing to understand here is we need to start with our view of history with I don't know what happened. Okay, and if we start with I don't know what happened, then we say, did they circulate the letters or did they not circulate the letters? Okay? If we start with I don't know, then we say there's a 50-50 chance whether or not they were circulated. And then we have some evidence that they were circulated, then that tips the scales that they were circulated. And I've given you 2 pieces of evidence here. So like, the important point to understand is people have a tendency to have sort of a certain bias with the Bible, whether they're in favor of Christianity or against it. But let's take a look at against it. They start with, oh, it was changed. Oh, we have no idea what was written back then. And if you start with that bias, then anything that leads to the conclusion that we do know what Paul wrote or something like that, then you're biased against it and you need like this mountain of evidence to change you. But like the rational starting point is, I don't know if the letters were circulated. Here's some evidence that they were. Well, now the scales have been tipped in the favor of it's more likely that they were circulated. So a rational person should not say, I don't know. A rational person should say they were probably circulated based on the evidence. Okay. So, and that's just, we have to do that with history in general. Now you say, well, Ben, why does it matter so much? Why do you keep talking about this circulation? Well, the issue is, once there are too many copies, nobody can change all the copies. So it doesn't take a lot of circulation for there to be too many copies, and then nobody can change all the copies. So like, it's very similar. People say it today. Once you post something on the internet, like I'm posting this video on the internet, once you post something on the internet, it's undestroyable. Because in our day, the electronic mechanisms that we have, inside computer chips, like make copies so fast and so many that like it's on so many. Once you upload something, it's on so many different servers and so many different places that it can never really be erased because it's always copies are just boom, 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 making copies. It's the same concept, but just not electronic. And it's the issue is once there's a bunch of copies, you can't change them all. Nobody can change them all. It's not like, okay, there's one copy of the book of Romans and then it wears out, so they need to make a new copy. And they have that one copy in Rome, and then they have the other copy, No, once these letters are circulating, it's impossible for anyone to change them all. Okay? Now, the question becomes like, okay, what is the time period we're looking at before to where we've got a bunch of copies and no one can change them all? You know what I mean? So like, well, the oldest actual physical piece of paper that's from the Bible is something called P52, and it's from the Gospel of John. I think it's chapter 10. I can't remember, but it's on both. The other side of the page has something else. Okay, so John, written 90 A.D., generally dated to the last or maybe the last. I mean, sometimes people say Revelation. Okay, the experts do not have a consensus on the date for P52, the actual fragment. Some experts would put it, 125 to 175 AD, and then other experts would put it at 110 to 150. So it's a 25-year shift. So you could, if you want to take the average, like basically you're saying 125 to 150 AD. So you're looking, if it's out, or basically you could say 100 to 175 AD is where the experts are coming in on this. It's tiny, so they don't want to do radiocarbon dating, and so they're just arguing about the paleography. Okay, there's not really a consensus on it, except to say that was somewhere around 100 to 175, somewhere in that. No one puts it before 100, no one puts it after 175. So you're talking about 10 to 85 years from when the consensus will say John was written. Although some people put John earlier, that's the more conservative Christians, and the non-Christians and the atheists and stuff will put it, all the way up to 90, but no one goes after 90. Okay, so the issue is this fragment is found in Egypt, and the consensus of scholars is that the Gospel of John was probably written in Asia Minor, which is modern-day Turkey. Okay, so we have to ask ourselves, what's more likely? That this was the only copy of John back then, and this is the first copy? Probably not. It's probably not the original. It's probably a copy of the original, because there's only one original, right? And then you make copies. So there have to be more copies than there are originals. So if you find a fragment, what's most rational to believe is that it's a copy, because that's most of what existed. If you find a scrap of newspaper today, what's more likely that that's the first copy of that's the first one that they made all the other ones based off of? Or is it more likely that that's a copy of the original? Okay. There's that. Then there's the question of so how did this text make its way from Asia Minor down to Egypt? Well, what's most likely is that it circulated its way down there. And so there you have it. Okay. You've got a lot of copies of this text being made. Even if there's just 3 or 4 or 5 copies of John spread from Turkey to Egypt, it's going to be pretty hard to change them all. It doesn't take a lot of circulation for this, to be a problem. So there we have it. So, all right, once there are too many copies, nobody can change all the copies. And we don't really need, to find, all of these ancient copies. If we just have enough fragments that are old enough and spread around enough places, then, we can establish that there were a lot of copies, pretty quickly, and that it was unlikely to be changed, fairly soon, because our later complete copies that we have probably date back to older, manuscripts that are lost to us. And so that's just what's most likely. Is it's unlikely that our later copies are, have all, they're all made from just one manuscript, manuscript copy. It's probably, there were lots of copies, most of them rotted, but the later ones survived, okay? So what this means is, if we have enough fragments and we have enough later copies, then we can say, probably, going back to the era, fairly soon, in the 2nd century, 100 to 200 AD, by, after 100 AD, these stuffs have circulated enough that, probably no one can change it by that point. So very shortly after the actual writing of it, no one's going to be able to change it because there's just too many copies. And this is based on the fragmentary evidence and then the later complete manuscript evidence. In general, we have 20-something thousand copies, manuscripts of the New Testament. That's going all the way from, the oldest P52 all the way up to the printing press, okay? That includes a lot of things. Like, that includes translations, which, become their own manuscript traditions. And these guys who talk about these things, like, there's translations into languages that no one even speaks anymore, like Syriac or Coptic. There's also Latin translations. And then the oldest manuscripts are all in Greek. So we conclude based on that it was probably written in Greek. And we can even identify, like, manuscript traditions. Because people, like, make goofs in the manuscript. And then the guy who copies it will make the same goof because he copied the goof. And so then we can identify sort of a family tree, if you will, like a web of all of these later copies for which we have thousands that have unique family histories going back that converge on, the originals. So, if people were making alterations to, so let's say no one can change them all, but what if everybody just changed their own text? So, like, what if everybody had their own version of Christianity and, like, changed their text? Well, if they, and one person made Jesus a woman, and one person made Jesus a spaceman, and one person made Jesus a slaveholder, and everybody changed their manuscript. If they did that, then the later manuscripts would all be different because of these different manuscript traditions in this family tree. And that's not what we find when we look at the evidence. What we find is that there are differences with the later complete manuscripts. And there's lots of differences. Most of those differences are like spelling errors, or they'll copy the same sentence twice, or they'll forget to copy a sentence and leave it out because you, like, skip a line by accident, and, stuff like this. They doodle in the page. But, like, the differences between the texts they're not that different. They're pretty much the same, So in general, there's an agreement. And so what we don't find is that everyone was changing the text willy-nilly. What we find is generally they're the same. And all we have to do is look at the later manuscripts, and we have enough evidence to piece back that, like, no one could have changed this. And no one was. So if the later manuscripts, which number in the thousands, agree with each other, then it's unlikely that these texts were altered. People argue back and forth. I've seen, like, 90-something% consistency between the manuscripts, and although there's a lot of discrepancies, which means, like, difference where somebody spells a word wrong, or, like, leaves a verse out by accident, or adds a word in, like, sometimes it'll be like, if you read a King James, it might specifically point out that Jesus is the Lord, like when he raises from the dead. And then an older manuscript might just say Jesus came back from the dead, and it won't Jesus the Lord came back from the dead. It might be something like that. The important thing to understand is these discrepancies, no major doctrine of Christianity is actually threatened by these discrepancies, which means that, like, they don't really amount to a big difference between anything. Okay, so all of that said, we now need to ask the question, all right, what about in the early days? Paul writes 1 Corinthians in 55 AD. What about when there's just a few copies? Like, I'm talking about before it can circulate. I mean, I don't know, maybe they made 4 or 5 copies in the city of Corinth of 1 Corinthians. Well, like, okay, at that early stage, somebody could go around town and maybe get them all. If you start making copies all over, it's going to get out of hand pretty quick. But, like, let's just hypothetically ask ourselves, what about, like, shortly after? There's sort of a window for, like, when it could have been altered. Before there were too many copies to change, but after it's been written. Okay? And this is what's called forgery. Okay? So, like, in other words, there's an ancient Greek medical doctor named Galen, and he wrote a book called How to Tell If a Book is Written by Galen. Because he says in the book that he went to a bookstore and he saw for sale in the bookstore in the window a book written by him. He said there was one problem. He never wrote the book. And so he put out a book that was actually written by him, and it was How to Tell If He Wrote Something. So the issue is within this guy's lifetime, people were forging texts in his name. All right, so if I was to take the book of Romans and try to change it from when Paul wrote it to when, and I was trying to change it early on. And I was, essentially what I would be doing is I would be forging a letter in Paul's name. Maybe I didn't change everything in the letter, but like, I'm essentially taking what I want to say and pretending as though Paul said it. Okay? And putting it in Paul's mouth. Or taking something out of Paul's mouth that I didn't like that he said. But essentially, I'm taking what he said, altering it to something else that I wanted, to be written, and that's basically forgery. So editing someone's text like that would be forgery because I'm putting their name on something that they didn't actually write. Or you can like wholesale, just make up a whole book that someone didn't write, and you're putting their name on it. So we know that ancient forgeries existed. I mean, Galen talks about it. The issue is that Galen was very famous and very much a big shot, but the internal evidence we have in the New Testament bears witness to Paul, especially. These guys were not big shots. So like, for me to forge a letter in your name has to carry some sort of weight or credibility or clout. It has to get, because otherwise, if you're a loser and no one cares what you think, then I'm just going to write a letter saying what I think and why I think you're wrong and put my name on it, or I'll put the name of somebody else on it who's a big shot. I'm not going to forge a letter in your name unless your name has value. And the evidence we have, like for example, from Paul's letters in 1 Corinthians, he's writing to the 1 Corinthians complaining about how they're divided, and some follow Paul, and some follow Apollos, and some follow Peter, and some follow Jesus. Okay, so in that situation, they're not going to forge letters in his name. They're just going to follow someone else. And you say, well, Ben, how do we know the church in Corinth was really divided? Well, that just comes down to historical reasoning and the historical method that historians use to determine things about the past. Paul is not going to write a letter to the church in Corinth about how they need to stop being divided if they weren't divided, because he's not going to lie to them about the fact that they are divided, because they full well know if they're divided. Just like Paul's not going to write a thank you note to the Philippians for sending him money to take care and food to take care of him while he's in jail if they didn't actually send him money. That whether or not they sent him money is something they full well know. And whether or not the Corinthian church is divided is something the Corinthian church full well knows. So what we see, the internal evidence that we have is, from Galatians 2, that they're not following what Paul taught, is that people wouldn't forge letters in Paul's name. Okay? What we also have is that a lot of the letters of the New Testament, like Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, are really important, but they're also anonymous. So there's no motivation to forge something like this because it doesn't have a name behind it. It's an anonymous text. Okay? And that's where things get interesting. Okay? But the problem is like the manuscript evidence that we have, even in fragmentary form, says that it didn't take very long for these texts to get really well circulated where no one can change them. Okay? So, like we said, just to cover a few final points, yes, there are a lot of discrepancies between the manuscripts. The majority of the discrepancies are spelling errors. People miss sentences by accident. They double sentences by accident. Sometimes what they would do is... and the discrepancies are useful for reconstructing the family tree, because you say, that guy made the same mistake as that guy, you copy from that guy, and then you add a new mistake. Okay. But the differences is not high enough to be a problem. Now, sometimes what happens is the guy copying the text, he looks over here, reads a sentence, then copies it over here, then looks back over here, reads, and then copies it over here. He looks back over here, and he accidentally skips one. And then copies it, and the copy is missing that one. Okay? So then after he's done, sometimes they would miss it. But sometimes they would go back and double check it and say, oh my goodness, I missed one. And they would put it in the margin next to where it would go. But then this would create a problem where it's like they didn't always know where to put. So sometimes you would have a sentence in different spots. You know, or here's another problem that would happen. Sometimes they would just doodle or write jokes in the margin, and no one would put that in the text. But sometimes they would write like a sermon note or something, or a thought that they had, and it would accidentally sound too familiar to what was like in the text of Corinthians or Romans or something, and then it would get added in by accident, and then you would get an alteration to the text. And one of the really famous examples that we have of this is the woman caught in adultery in John 8, I think, where the woman's caught in adultery, and it's everybody's favorite Jesus story that's not in the Bible. Okay, so that doesn't show up in any of our copies until long after we've got complete copies. Like, I think it's around 1000 AD. It shows up in like a few of them by accident. But because people are like making copies of copies, it got in there as a goof, and who knows where the story came from. But it got in the copies, and then it's like those copies that copy that copy carry it. And so then you have a bunch of copies that have that in them, and then you have other ones in other places that don't. And the older ones don't. None of them have it. Okay, so this story where Jesus says, let him without sin throw the first stone at her, not really in the original. It's an obvious mistake, but it helps us reconstruct this family tree. So you might ask me, well, Ben, how does that get in all of our Bibles? Well, it doesn't. The issue is that when the printing press was invented, nobody really understood the power of, like, the significance of, they knew it was a big deal, but they had no idea like how big of a deal it was going to become. So like one of the two things that were flying off the shelves right from the start, the two first bestsellers, were copies of the Greek New Testament and also erotic literature. So copies of the Bible in the original languages and erotic literature are the two first best-selling types of literature, until eventually Martin Luther wrote his 95 Theses, and it became a best-selling book by accident. Nobody knew that was going to happen. And it, like, people are trying to burn all the copies, and there's nothing they can do. You just print more, And so he accidentally wrote the first, like, bestseller book, But before that, it was copies of the New Testament in the original Greek and and smut literature. Okay, so like these copies, when people made these early editions of the New Testament in Greek, the people who were making them and printing them had no idea like the significance of what they were doing, and they were just doing good work. They were like, okay, I've got access to 5 manuscripts. I'll bring those manuscripts together. I'll try to compile them and look at the discrepancies and make a copy based on those 5 or something. So like when the King James is translated into English in 1611, those guys they have access to like, I think like one, if I remember right, one edition of the Greek New Testament that was based off 5 manuscripts. And so any errors that were in that edition make it into the King James. Like the woman caught in adultery. Or like this longer ending of Mark. Or, for example, that the mark of the beast is 666, which is a goof that got in some of the copies, which it's really 616. Okay? But then nobody realized that the King James was going to become incredibly popular, and lots and lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of people were going to read it, and it was going to it has a massive effect on the English language. Like a lot of our biblical terminology, like phrases that we use, like we say the writing is on the wall, or we say a wolf in sheep's clothing. This is how the King James translators chose to translate, Greek stuff, which sounds like way different, or Aramaic and like all this different stuff. And it's defined our language. You know what I mean? We say, "Blessed be the peacemakers." You know, that's not what it says in the original. Like let's take a look at, see if I can read. So we'll go Matthew 5, and then we'll look it up in how it originally sounds. Let's see. All right, the Greek. Where is the Greek? Oh, all right. So many English to scroll through. Here's the Greek. Okay. Matthew 5 in Greek. So, like, blessed be the peacemakers. It's makarioi hoi proxy toi numetai. Okay, so like it sounds totally different is my point. The King James translators chose a way to translate in that, blessed be the peacemakers, blessed be this, blessed to be the poor in spirit. I think it's, blessed makarioi is like inner life joy, the poor pataxoi, the pneumati spirit, pneumatic, that they is that theirs is the kingdom of the heaven, but it's really like hati aten esten e basilean ton uranen, So my point is, the King James Bible became really popular and like a really big deal, and so that became the Bible to most people. And so like you can print your Bible that has all of the accidental goofs corrected, but nobody's going to buy it. Everybody wants to buy the Bible with the goofs in it. And so what they do with stuff like the NIV, for example, if you look at that woman caught in adultery part, it just has it in like brackets. It still puts it in there for you, but it has it in brackets, and it'll say like, some manuscripts don't have this, which is true, but they're kind of hiding. It's like, no, most of the manuscripts don't have this. This is only in a few. Okay. So anyway, hopefully that covers everything to answer this question. And at this point, I'm just going to say adieu to you and you and you. Thank you for your time.